You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News. Hey folks, it's 7 p.m. and I'm Tom Bewick, and it's a whole new working week. Unless you work at weekends, that is. Like a lot of us in the skills sector these days. Weekends, I hear you shout. What are those? Anyway, how's your Monday been so far? Has it been another one of those days playing with all the virtual conferencing software? Zoom, Teams, GoToWebinar, list feels endless. Did you remember to unmute before launching into a great peroration in front of your colleagues? Or maybe you forgot to mute with the whole domestic kicking off in the background. Don't worry, we've all done it. Start of a new week, folks, means only one thing. A full 5 episodes of Skills World Live. Yes, as your FE community radio presenter, I'm really looking forward to the week ahead with some really interesting topics and phoning guests to inform and entertain you. Quick flavour of what is coming up this week. I'll be talking to a former Secretary of State who has written a new book about the future of higher education. A regular contributor to Sky's TV newspaper review will be putting forward an argument that perhaps we send too many young people to university. That will be a good one. And later in the week, I'll be talking to a think tank boss about his controversial report published back in January that claimed the skills system was full of too many, and I quote, fake apprenticeships. All that, though, coming up later in the week on Skills World Live. Tonight, we've got a great show coming up with a focus on schools. I'll be putting the question to my guests, when should the schools reopen? And I've not got one, not two, but 5 serving teachers and head teachers, no less, will be talking to me this evening. But first on Skills World Live, let's find out the top stories making the headlines in the FE sector this evening. The boss of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, has told the Education Select Committee that a considerable number of the inspection service's 1,700 staff are currently underoccupied. Speaking today via video link, Spielman told MPs that suitably qualified colleagues had offered their time to work in children's homes and school settings, whereas other employees were being redeployed elsewhere in the civil service. The watchdog announced a suspension of all its physical inspection visits of schools, colleges and private training providers last month, when the government's strict social distancing measures were first introduced. In other news, Derby College is forging ahead with adapting workspaces for the first students who will join the new T-level programmes this September. Various facilities are being upgraded in line with the T-level focus on work experience, thanks to a £1.2 million capital programme, part funded by the Education Skills Funding Agency. Derby College is part of the first wave of T-level programmes focusing on professional construction, digital production and education and childcare due to commence this September. Recruitment for the 3 programmes is continuing during lockdown, with capacity for around 100 students to start the new qualifications this autumn. And finally, the TV Bake Off star Prue Leith has lent her support to the FE Food Bank Friday initiative. This was highlighted by this programme last Friday. 27 colleges the length and breadth of the country have raised more than £20,000 to support vulnerable people in the community during COVID-19. The TV presenter and novelist, Leith, said on Twitter that she really liked the way so many students were getting involved and would be encouraging more colleges to join. That's all your Skills World News from fenews.co.uk. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Bewick, @FE News. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111. It's that part of the evening. It's time for the big debate. And tonight's theme is, when should the schools reopen? Now, this is a bit of a difficult subject, actually. It seems to arise quite a few passions, and hopefully we'll debate some of those on the show this evening. Worth saying, we do live in unprecedented times. I mean, a government has never had to cancel a whole summer's examinations before, never mind order our children to stay at home. Even during the Blitz, I think children still went to school. You'll remember, at the beginning of all this, the fear was closing the schools too early, that the children of vulnerable and key workers might particularly suffer. Government has responded, of course, by saying schools should and would stay open for families who work in the National Health Service or other frontline key worker occupations, and that's included the most vulnerable pupils. But since then, we've seen other countries take a different path to tackling the coronavirus. Sweden has allowed its primary schools to remain open. Denmark, too, is gradually opening up the schools for younger kids, with experts there saying that the long-term damage to their health, educational and welfare needs could far outweigh the benefits of any lockdown. Meanwhile, closer to home, the unions representing thousands of teachers and their health and welfare needs have started a petition and have written to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, saying there should be no rush back to reopen schools. The debate at times has got quite heated. A Telegraph columnist recently attracted the full lashback on social media for suggesting teachers needed to be, and I quote, show some courage and get back into the classroom. One rude troll even suggested that the columnist should commit suicide for making such comments. Now, after this song, we'll try and restore calmness and rationality back to this debate by speaking with two teachers. That's right, two teachers who have very interesting perspectives on the whole theme of tonight's big debate. That's Living Life there by DJ Den's The Rooster. Interesting track. As with all our tracks, I've told you before that on this community radio station, we're very much into supporting independent artists. So head over to Epidemic Sound and select the tracks. After all, if you don't like what I'm playing, just let me know. Email at skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Now, to continue and to start tonight's debate, I'm delighted to be joined on the line by Kevin Rooney, who is a teacher in London and a published author of a number of books and articles. and Gerry Glazier, who's a teacher and also an executive member of the National Committee of the National Education Union. Chaps, thanks for joining Skills World this evening. We've got Kevin and Gerry on the line.
How you doing?
Yeah, good.
Hi there.
Coming in nice and loud and clear. Thank you very much for joining us this evening to kick off tonight's big debate. Now, Kevin, let's start with you. You wrote in a recent online article that teachers should be known for their open-mindedness and tolerance of different views. But it appears that this is a quote, it said, but it appears that the anxiety induced by the COVID-19 crisis is amplifying a pre-existing trend towards censorship and the closing down of debate. We are losing the art of being able to disagree well. What do you say to that?
Yes, no, that's spot on, and I would definitely stand by that. And that was in relation to an article that was written last week. When Joanna Williams argued that it was time to open up the schools. And my position was you could disagree with her, but the vitriol and the abuse that she suffered was out of all proportion to the argument that she was putting forward. And they were called to bring the Telegraph to Ipsos and to censor what she said and so on and so forth, and all sorts of attacks. And here's the rub. I think it's an absolutely legitimate conversation to start about when should we open the schools. Now, I'm not a scientist, and I absolutely accept that you got to listen to the science to an extent, but I don't think science should dictate the discussion full stop. I think education should play a part in kicking the ball off about when we open schools, how we open schools, is there room for experimentation and innovation, etc., and how we do that. And I think that's a good, healthy conversation to have.
Okay, well, let's come on to the theme about closing down debates and censorship in a little while. But let's just bring Gerry in now. So, Gerry, as a trade union leader, your union have been pretty clear that they don't think the schools should reopen until it is safe to do so. Do you think, though, Kevin's got a point about how COVID-19 anxiety in the profession has potentially closed down the debate?
No, I don't think he has, actually. I think what we are trying to do as a union is be very responsible and ensure that when schools do reopen, and of course teachers want them to reopen, we do so when, as far as practically possible, it's safe for them to do so. And I think that's the big issue now, is that how do we get ourselves out of the lockdown by gradual degrees and ensure that we can open schools so they make a positive contribution to society but don't make a negative contribution to the infection rates. And we're very worried about that because we know that kids are super spreaders. They themselves may not have a direct impact on them about the COVID-19, but they can spread the virus to other adults and to other critical workers, which can undermine the whole system. So we think we're being responsible. We want to see schools come back, but only when it's really safe to do so, and that we can put in place regimes that enable it to be safe. So I think simply we think when schools go back, it's going to have to be gradual, it's going to have to be partial, and I think there's a very strong consensus that there's going to have to be physical distancing. I don't like social distancing because it's physical distancing we're talking about. And I think parents are with us. I think parents don't want their children to go back to unsafe schools.
Sure. I mean, it's a huge moral dilemma, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you've got an argument that I've heard advanced by, for example, these Scandinavian experts where schools have already opened, even though deaths tragically are still quite high and the infection rate isn't particularly low in those countries. But there's an argument advanced that actually it's detrimental to the education, the welfare of those children, particularly the disadvantaged, if they're not getting their schooling education. Equally, I think the point that you're putting across is that one needs to look to the health and welfare of the teaching workforce, but of course the transmission mechanism of kids being in schools, which by definition anyone who's got kids, and I've got 3 of them, know that it's very hard to, never mind socially distance them, but also physically distance them sometimes as well. I mean, Kevin, do you not think Gerry and his union have a really strong point that we shouldn't be rushing back anytime soon to open the school gates and potentially have a whole kind of generation of super spreaders on our hands?
Well, first of all, I think you've got a very good point, and it's about the social impact. And people seem to forget that when you're talking about the impact of things, it's not just about the physical safety of people. It's also about the mental and psychological and social impact of kids who've been isolated at home. So that's a point well made. Look, let's not get silly about this. I'm up for listening to the science as well. But as it happens, the science itself is not absolutely uniformal. So, for example, in Radio 4 on Saturday morning, there was a fascinating discussion amongst the scientists and medical people about the 2-meter distance argument, and what came out of the conversation. It was a myth. It was just made up to simplify things, for example. But let me tell you what I mean about having a conversation. I don't like this idea that people's bottom line is, oh, the science says this, so let's just, stop the conversation. Why don't we have the voluntary participation of the willing? For example, those teachers, they're absolutely prepared to go back to school straight away and are healthy. Let's fold classes. Let's look at all those university halls which are empty. Let's see if we can move some schools across sites. Let's at least get a conversation going about how we can do this. I do think some people are a bit too keen and enthusiastic to close conversation down, to kill it before it starts. And worse than that, demonize those people who really want to open up the conversation. I repeat, I do not think this is simply a question, a case for the science. Educators need to be involved in this conversation.
Yeah. Jerry, the science is one thing. But there's also ultimately some political decisions that are going to have to be made about the schools eventually reopening. Kevin was advancing a more nuanced argument there about saying, well, why don't we, and I think you actually touched on this in your first contribution about a gradual opening. Do you think there's some common ground there between Kevin's sort of nuanced position, your idea of a gradual reopening? I mean, is Denmark, is that an example to follow in terms of starting with the early years and primary school kids perhaps first?
Can I just, before I go on to that, can I just
Sure.
say that, of course there will be dispute amongst scientists, but they're the best source of accurate information. And then both of you mentioned politics, and I think that's where the dangers come in, because the political imperatives are the ones which may well drive the decisions in a way which, unfortunately, have very negative and serious long-term consequences. So there's nothing wrong with caution. And of course, I do want to make this point as well. Many teachers schools aren't closed. Schools are open to look after vulnerable children and key workers, and many teachers are going in to do that. So that is significant. In terms of the structural approach, then I think there just needs to be sensitivity and realism and pragmatism, and a willingness to do things in a way which people are comfortable about, and ensure that there's a gradual process of reintegration into schools. I think that's going to be inevitable. It is significant, as I said earlier, that the general population support that caution, and why not? Because, I'm very conscious about what happened, not that I was there in 1920, that second spike in that flu pandemic was enormous compared with the first and the third. And surely we need to be cautious, while science is telling us to be cautious in that respect, because we don't want this whole pandemic in this country to shoot up again with those really very, very, very serious implications and high numbers of deaths.
But Jerry, I'm in school every day, so I am in with the kids. There's quite a lot of kids in my school whose parents are doctors. In fact, both mothers and fathers are doctors, and also there's a fair few looked after kids. So since the close down of since students were told not to come to school, the vast majority, I think I've missed 2 days, so I've been to school every day. And what I can absolutely tell you is my school's a huge, big school, right? And what you have is basically less than 20 kids in school at the moment. And I'm suggesting, why not get the year 10s in, for example? Why not get the year 12s in? I think we can absolutely start that conversation now. And it's not about being reckless. And I am suggesting that some people seem to me to be going out of their way to avoid having that conversation.
Jerry, you talked about words like gradual, and Kevin is at least saying, well, let's get year 10, year 11 students potentially into the schools now. Do you have in your mind, does the union have a date in mind when potentially pupils could come back to school?
No, we don't at this moment, because we are going to listen to the science and make sure that we're comfortable with it. I take the point that Kevin's making about how you may be able to group people together, and certainly you could possibly group older kids together, but it doesn't diminish the fact they've got to be grouped together in a safe way. I'm also interested in debate about who should be given the priority in respect to this. Because,
well, answer that for our listeners then. Who should be given the priority, in your view?
Well, I think we need to think carefully about the significance of who goes back and when and how. Because there is a school of thought which says, of course, that younger children are the ones on which their educational foundation is now being built. That's a very significant experience which has a positive contribution to their learning going forward. The older children, if you can make the appropriate arrangements and motivate them, and I pay tribute to my members who are doing an awful lot of work because there's so many kids who aren't in school, because their parents are anxious that they're not there, to provide opportunities for those children, a lot of online learning, a lot of marking, a lot of contact with those kids to make sure they're all right and their families are all right. And that's the right thing to do. Yes, we've been locked down for 5 weeks now. Schools have been closed for just over a month. That isn't a huge amount of time. The summer holidays are 6 weeks. So I think we need to get things into proportion. But we certainly need to ensure that when schools go back, there's enough staff to go back, because that's a big problem about the number of staff who are self-isolating legitimately. The failure of the government to deliver the testing they promised at the end of last week is an issue as well. Because if you can't get if you go online, you can't get the test, and you have the symptoms for 7 days and they go away, you don't know whether you've had it or not. So there's a big issue there.
Yeah, it sounds like.
I think.
Go on.
I think we got a couple of points of agreement there in commonality. So I agree with you about the importance of the testing, but I also think you make a really good point about let's have a conversation about who goes back, when, and how. Should it be the young ones? Should it be the year 10? Should it be the year 12s? So I'm up for that conversation, and I definitely have the answer. But the fact that we begin that conversation, I think, is a good thing.
Great. Well, look, as a father of 3 children that I'm homeschooling at the moment, I can absolutely testify to the daily, sometimes hourly contact that we're getting from teachers. So it's probably not correct to sort of suggest that the schools are closed. They're open for key worker children, for some of the most vulnerable. But just to come back, though, Jerry, to this point, I mean, will there come a tipping point where potentially the actions that we're taking to try and get on top of this invisible enemy, which is the coronavirus, and potentially some of those other invisible things that frankly can go on when the state is no longer the corporate parent during the day?
Well, yes, I mean, that's a point of view. But I think what Kevin was saying, there needs to be plans. And I agree with that. I think what's been sadly lacking from the government is any clarity about how they're going to release the lockdown, when and where and in what stages. I've got a son who lives in Canada, in Saskatchewan, and he sent me the province plan, which is a 5-stage plan with dates on the first 2 stages. The third, fourth, and fifth stage are contingent on what happens in the first 2 stages. But at least they've got a plan, and people can see it. But I tell you what's significant: in that plan, there is no mention of schools going back.
Right. But it's a plan nevertheless, and it's something
Absolutely.
that arguably our government, and it's been obviously criticised in the media for not being more forthcoming with a so-called exit strategy for COVID-19. Kevin, your views on the potential tipping point here between, if you like, the cure, which is let's physically distance, let's try and get on top of the infection rate for COVID-19, and potentially these other challenges and problems that are building up in our households as we speak. I mean, I'm obviously a very engaged parent with my kids learning during the day. I try to juggle a day job and also be there to support my children. But I've got to be honest, I feel very, very lacking in really the support that they need when I go through their various subject areas. I mean, it is increasingly a very wearing issue, isn't it, for parents?
I mean, the tipping point question is a really, really, really good question. Can I say what I think?
Please do.
Which Jerry might not agree with it. I actually think just over the past few days at the weekend, for example, there's a bit of a silent rebellion taking place where there are lots more people out on the streets and the parks and sitting down for a couple of hours in the sun or getting into their cars and driving. And I'm not so sure that if this continues and the government says, lockdown continues, that people are going to continue to abet. So I've got a feeling, and it's just political instinct no more than that the tipping point is not too far away. And when Jerry said at the very start about parents support this, I think at the very start parents did, and perhaps the majority still do, but I definitely think that majority is chipping away at the edges as people become increasingly frustrated. And the thing about the science is, and this is a really nuanced point. Churchill a long time ago, who wasn't necessarily my favourite person, made a point about the science. We said we want the science on top, TAP, not on top. And I think that, I don't agree with Jerry. And I don't know if Jerry's actually saying this. This is just at the end of the day, the bottom line is this is down to the science. I do think politics is involved, and I do think education unions, of which I'm a trade union member, are political. And we shouldn't be defensive about being political and getting involved in conversations about education and how we see things. And I do think that we have to have that conversation. And there are disagreements out there. There are disagreements with my friends who are fellow teachers. Some of them are absolutely adamant we shouldn't go back to September. Some of them are thinking we should be back within the next fortnight, or certainly after half-term break and so on and so forth. So yes, science is important, but I don't think it's necessarily the be-all and end-all in this conversation.
Okay. Jerry, last word to you. The trade union needs to be more political. What do you think?
Well, I don't think anybody could accuse the National Education Union of not being political. Not party political, but extremely political. We've always been proud of our position, our policies. We advocate them, democratically arrived at. And we need to lead and reflect our membership. And that's what we're doing. We know very well what's going on with the membership. But ironically, the consequence of this pandemic has been that we've had to communicate with our members in different ways, and we've had much more communication and feedback from a greater number of members, not just the smaller activists. And we're certainly willing to engage and base our policies on how members see the situation. And you're right, there's a whole range, Kevin's right, a range of perspectives. But I do think that we haven't got a lack of perspective. We want the government to be clear. We want the government to have clear plans. And what is absolutely the case, whenever the schools go back and however they go back, it won't happen overnight. It's got to be planned for properly to ensure it's a successful change.
Okay, a phased opening. Jerry Glazier, a teacher and also a member of the National Executive Committee of the National Education Union, and Kevin Rooney, who's a teacher and has joined us from his home in London this evening. Thank you to you both for being on The Big Debate.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, that got things going, didn't it? Let's have a musical interlude now. This is called Last Days of Summer, even though we're at the end of spring. Enjoy. Sebastian Slice there, last days of summer, before we even got to the end of spring. Now, tonight's big debate, when should the schools reopen? I thought that was a really fascinating discussion there. Not necessarily people really disagreeing with each other, but just looking at all the different perspectives and the different nuances of the debate. So continuing with our teacher theme, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined from the West Midlands by Sharon Eeles, who's a head teacher of two nurseries. I think they're called the Osborne and Featherstone Nursery Schools. And also Garry Ratcliffe, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Galaxy Trust, a multi-academy trust of 3 primary schools in Dartford. Welcome both to Skills World. Sharon, Garry, you there?
Hello.
Hi there, Tom. Hi.
Great. I do love it when the studio technology works and actually able to bring you in and connect the worlds of education and FE. Sharon, how do you think the lockdown's going for parents in your part of the world? What about the more disadvantaged kids?
Yeah, I think quite a lot of the parents are starting to kind of really struggle. I know with the younger children, they learn in a very active way. They're very lots of energy. They need constant stimulation, and I think some of our parents are beginning to kind of really find that difficult and constant, and they don't get that break from them. And some of the disadvantage, a lot of my families live in high-rise flats with no access to a garden. And I have a lot of sympathy when you sort of see on the news that people have been out sitting in parks, and
Yeah, absolutely.
I can kind of really appreciate, how difficult it is having maybe 2 or 3 children under 5 rolling around in a flat all day, every day. I think it's really, really tough for some of the families out there at the moment.
Yeah, and what about homeschooling kids of that age? I mean, my kids are primary school and one's a secondary school, but at least you can just sit down with them and a lesson plan that's been emailed to you by one of the wonderful teachers and try and go through things. But I mean, how easy is that to try and sort of still give? Okay, I mean, these are very young kids, toddlers in some cases, but they'll still need some kind of education and nurturing and support, won't they?
That's right. And I mean, we're putting out lots of activities for parents to do with their children, but they are activities that need parental involvement, which if you're working at home is very difficult to work and try and keep your child doing those learning activities. And again, for some of our disadvantaged families, they might not have English as their first language. I live in Birmingham. It's a very multicultural area, so some of the families are struggling with reading things on our online kind of platform, reading the activities, being able to do that.
Yeah.
Some of them just don't have the technology.
No,
so I've had a lot of parents saying, well, I've only got a phone to do like the little online games and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that digital divide.
An iPad.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a lot of assumptions often made, isn't there, about what is possible with homeschooling. I mean, I'm talking to a guy who's running a great initiative, the Oak National Online Academy, towards the end of the show. And obviously that was one of the questions about access to some of this technology I was going to talk to him about. But Garry, you're on the line, and you're a chief executive of a multi-academy trust for 3 primary schools in Dartford. How are you finding, the issue of trying to support vulnerable kids in particular during the lockdown?
Tom, I think it's worth saying to start with, before the grand title of being a chief executive officer, I was a head teacher and executive head. So I've done the job as well. And it's really tough at the moment. But I think, there are some really resilient families out there. My schools serve a really wide catchment, so you've got really affluent families and then quite significant disadvantage as well. And what we've tried to do as a trust is to cover as many bases as we can. So we've done the online learning thing. We've put loads of stuff on Facebook. We've sent home a keeping in touch pack at the end of the Easter holidays with very simple activities that can be done on paper and just with a pencil or a pen. But I think that the most important thing for us in terms of supporting all of our families is just to be really clear with them that at this point in this crisis, it's most important for them to be looking after their well-being and their mental health, and far less important, whether they've done an hour's literacy on a particular day. Because, we will be able to catch up with that at some point. What we won't be able to cope with so well is so many children with higher anxiety and all of the associated issues that are going to be arising from this particular crisis. And it is a crisis and it is a challenge. And, it's like nothing we've ever seen. So,
yeah,
obviously,
totally. I mean, it's unprecedented. It's totally unprecedented. But on the theme of tonight's big debate, I don't know if you got a chance to listen to two previous guests, who were debating some of the very difficult moral dilemmas around, a teaching workforce coming back. When should they come back? Not least, potentially threats to their health and well-being. Then that's got to be balanced off with, obviously, some of the concerns around our kids do eventually, need an education. And other countries, and why I think it's really interesting actually talking to two teachers and head teachers who are at the sort of foundation stage, if you like, of our education system. Other countries appear to have gone down that route of opening those schools first. I mean, would you support a gradual opening of primary schools, early years settings before the summer holiday?
I find that really confusing, actually.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Say why, Garry. Yeah, go on. Say why. Why you find it confusing?
Our younger children are very tactile. They learn through experiential learning. They learn by touching, by tasting. I don't know many 3-year-olds that don't have their hands in their mouths constantly. And obviously lack the awareness and the appreciation of the situation we're in. So in terms of primary learning, I would be much more keen on getting our year 6s or our year 5s back into school earlier than our younger children. However, the flip side to that is that our early years professionals, in my opinion, in primary education are the most skilled amongst us, because developing the youngest children is such a skill and such a difficult job that actually those children who are 3, 4 and 5 years old are missing out on big chunks of that experiential learning and learning with others. And that's a real challenge.
But it sounds... I
would totally agree in that. I mean, at the moment, we've joined the 2 nurseries with our local primary school just because we had a real lack of staff. So this way that we can staff it for the key workers and vulnerable children. And I would say we've got sort of from 2 up to kind of the year 6, and I would say our younger children, those nursery reception year 1 children, trying to do socially distancing is almost impossible. And if a child, certainly with them coming back, they've had a big break from nursery, they're going to be upset, they're going to kind of need that kind of comfort. A teacher's then not supposed to kind of comfort a crying child because of social distancing. And I think that goes against everything that early years practitioners, we're there for the kind of emotional well-being of the children as well as the other areas of learning. And I think we've really got to consider that and the safety of the children and safety of the staff, because we do have in our schools quite a few staff with underlying health conditions. So the head teacher of the primary school we've joined with, she's a type 1 diabetic, so she's self-isolating at the moment, which is why we've joined the schools together. So are we going to put her at greater risk by bringing some of these younger children that won't be able to understand why they can't go up to an adult or go up to a friend? And I would agree, the older children, you'd be able to talk that through and the rationale behind it a lot more.
I mean, there are all these really difficult trade-offs, aren't there? I mean, there's obviously combating the virus itself, and the whole point of why we're all under lockdown at the moment is to get that transmission rate down. I think there's also concerns about parents' mental health well-being, children's mental health well-being. I mean, Garry, so last word to you. I mean, in terms, obviously, as a head teacher that has a responsibility, as indeed Sharon will too, around safeguarding. And I used to be a chair of a local education authority, and I was responsible for children's sort of social services. So I got that insight into perhaps actually something that the public are not fully aware of, your role as educators and leaders to, ensure children are safe, not only in a educational setting, but, in the whole setting, their home setting as well. I mean, are you confident that you can still keep an eye on those kids, frankly, that, where school might be actually a bit of a salvation for them most days, with a hot school meal and all the rest of it.
If there's one argument for me, Tom, about schools reopening or opening to more children, it's exactly that, because safeguarding is a real worry for me. We've got very, very strong, very robust systems in place. We've got members of staff making regular phone calls home. We've got, we've updated our policies, we've updated our risk assessments to make sure that we know exactly who the most vulnerable families are. However, they aren't necessarily the children that are coming to school that we can just say hello to every day. And a teacher that has known a particular family for 3, 4, 5 years will pick up immediately if there's something wrong on a particular day. And if there are the most vulnerable children not coming to school, if the schools were open and a vulnerable child wasn't coming into school for a week, you'd be really concerned. So, it is my biggest worry, but we have put those plans into place to do as much as we possibly can.
Yeah.
What the answer to that, I think, is maybe for us to really be encouraging more of those children with the social worker, those children with a greater vulnerability, encouraging more of them to be coming into school, because they're certainly not coming into our schools at the moment. Yeah. We have, as I say, 3 schools, and we had 48 children across the 3 schools in today, out of a possible 2,000.
Yeah. Well, as we said at the start of the show, the schools are not closed. You're still open. And obviously we've got people like yourself and Sharon at the front line, still ensuring that those vulnerable kids are looked after and they do get an education. Alas, that's all we've got time for on this segment. But Garry Ratcliffe of the Galaxy Trust and Sharon Eeles, who's a head teacher of the Osborne and Featherstone nursery schools in Birmingham. Thanks both for joining me this evening. Pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye, Tom.
Bye. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. Always good to talk to educational leaders who are absolutely at the front line during this COVID-19 lockdown. Great debate there too. Okay, let's have some music now, shall we? Let's start with Klinger. It's a track called Find Myself.
Sometimes it really feels like I lose control. Honestly, I can't even find my home. 'Cause when you see light, I tend to fade. With city lights and you're in space, and I don't think I'm ever gonna get it right.
That's Klinger with What 34S and a track called Find Myself. Right, let's continue with this theme of how are our young people, our children, being supported during the COVID-19 lockdown. And I'm talking now to a chap, Matt Hood. Are you on the line? Principal at Oak National Academy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome, Matt. Now, look, when I remember I was just sort of, surfing through my Twitter account, and your academy it just went viral. It just kept on coming up, all the amazing things that you're offering to parents. How did the how did the whole thing get off the ground?
This is one of those stories that you sort of know you were there and you know you were working on it, but pinpointing the detailed things that happened in the order that they happened is a little tricky because of the pace. There was a poll by Teacher Tap, which is a sort of YouGov for education, surveyed about 6,000 teachers, and it had asked them, what is it that would be most helpful to you to help support all of the pupils that you're responsible for to keep learning at home? And about 65% of the teachers who were surveyed said that free online, open access resources are the number one thing that would make a big difference to them. And the challenge for educators up and down the country at the moment is how do we make that happen? And some schools are in a really fortunate position. They've made more progress on having online platforms with lessons available on them. Some have made less progress, and everybody needed to turn that around in a couple of weeks. And so a good old-fashioned tale of we did some work with the haves, those that did have this available, and asked them to make it available to everybody. They generously did, and we had about a week or so to record 180 odd lessons from about 40 different teachers, get those online, and we've just today brought the second batch of those lessons online, and we will keep getting those lessons available every week for as long as all of our pupils aren't back at school. And
roughly, how many sort of downloads, how many parents, how many lessons, how many children do you think the Academy is reaching at this moment in time?
So the numbers are a little mind-boggling, actually, and way beyond what we expected when a little group of people sort of jumped into a WhatsApp group 2 or 3 weeks ago. So last week we had close to 1 million pupils access one of our lessons. So far, we've had about 2.5 million of lessons completed. And the numbers going up and up and up. We thought, maybe we'd had a lucky day last Monday. There was a buzz around it and people were finding out about it. But numbers today are about 40% higher than they were a week ago. We're just overwhelmed by
sounds
the
like
words
it
that people have had, and we're just delighted to be able to help.
I'm sure the online presence has helped, and social media can help as well. It seems to me like your whole academy went viral very quickly. To what extent do you think parents also endorsing this and telling other parents is a big factor for why so many millions of lessons have already been downloaded?
Yeah, it's difficult to pick apart the different reasons. We're trying to get some sort of understanding, but again, another WhatsApp group of my closest friends, a friend in there has screen grabbed a conversation in her local mum's WhatsApp group where another mum is telling all the other mums about it in a WhatsApp group of mums. So it's certainly travelling around through a variety of different conversations. I got a message from my brother with my nephew sat in front of it earlier this afternoon, and I think it's mainly going via schools, but I think you're right, there is some parent-to-parent sharing going on as well.
Yeah, sure. And in terms of this whole debate about digital divide, by definition it's an online school. That's the product you're delivering, obviously via different applications and different tablets, phones, computers. To what extent do you worry a little bit about those families and perhaps kids that don't have access to the best technology or even broadband in some cases to download your programs?
So we worry about this a lot. The team of people and volunteers who got involved here have spent their entire careers working in and around schools that serve disadvantaged communities. And part of the rationale for us was to try and make lessons more available for everybody. But there remains, a gap between those who do have those devices and broadband connections and other things, and those who don't. We've tried to do a few things to at least not exacerbate the problem. So our platform, which you can get at the national.academy, is available on every different type of device. So it works on everything from a smartphone right the way through. It also works on a smart TV, which is another device that's often sort of missed out of this conversation where you can access things. But for sure, there are definitely pupils who don't have access to those devices, or maybe there's one device in the home which 3 pupils are sharing. There are a couple of things going on there. I know that the government has now got a scheme.
That's right.
We're waiting on all the details to get more devices. And the other great resource is the BBC, who are obviously able to put things through the TV, which far more families have access to. And so through a kind of combination of school supporting with hard copy resources and worksheets, more devices, more resources, and the BBC, we're hopefully able to cover the vast majority of children. But, if you're a parent and you can't access anything at the moment, please, my advice would be get in touch with your school. They will want to hear from you and they'll want to help.
You're one of these examples, along with all those wonderful teacher volunteers, where, during a crisis, you've effectively innovated with something that people may think is just going to be around for the period of the lockdown. But what's the long-term plans for the Oak National Academy?
So we've not managed to lift our head up long enough yet to
get the lockdown over first, and then you can
exactly what this could be or what this might be, if indeed anything. I think one of the things that I'm reasonably confident about is there will be some sort of phased return probably if and when schools reopen. And so beyond the immediate period where, the overwhelming majority of kids are at home, there are a small number of kids that are still in school, but the overwhelming majority are at home. I think, the need for support for people who are, learning at home will be there for, at least till the end of this term in some way, shape or form, if not beyond. And so, we're trying to make this organisation that we've built in a couple of weeks more and more robust. There are also a couple of other things that are really important to us. So this week and hopefully live by next week, we're increasing the amount of specialist resources that we have available. So improving accessibility for pupils who might have hearing impairments, for example, providing resources for parents whose children attend schools in the specialist sector, just so that we can maximise the number of pupils who can access the work that we do. Again, it's really important to us as educators that everybody is able to keep learning at home, and that's a big priority for us. Yeah,
Matt Hood, Principal at Oak National Academy, brilliant initiative. Thanks for joining Skills World this evening.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Bye.
You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. Well, that was absolutely brilliant example, wasn't it, of innovation in a crisis. Short track now, and then I'll give you details of what's going on tomorrow and the rest of the week and how you can get involved in Skills World Live.
all your colors. Surrounded, all up in your zone, I am surrounded. 'Cause I like the way when you're around in the morning, and I love the way that we fit out when it gets boring. You're the one I talk to when I hit my lows, and I am the one when you need just somebody right by your side, a body to rescue your mind. Just somebody, I'm the one to find when you need someone to rescue your mind.
Well, that's about all we've got time for this evening. What a great show, and a really, really good debate this evening. Fantastic guests, fantastic contributors. So don't forget that if you want to be on the show, contact us at skillsworld@fenews.co.uk, and you can also call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111, and one of the wonderful Skills World Live team will get back to you, I'm sure. Just leaves me now just to say a couple of quick thank yous. This programme's editor is Kelly O'Meara of fenews.co.uk, and digital producer is Ellie Hansen. Skills World Live is an FE News production supported by the Federation of Awarding Bodies Platinum Partners programme. Contact us at Skills World Live. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter @Tom Bewick, @FENews. Use the hashtag SkillsWorld. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111. That's it, folks. Join me tomorrow at 7 p.m. on Skills World Live. You're listening to Skills World Live with Tom Bewick. News, views and interviews in association with FE News.